Hello, so welcome back after lunch. So just to help you digest, I think we've got a paper which will give you a lot of food for thought. If you haven't had enough to eat, but I think you're all eating quite well. So I'm really happy to welcome Ted Schrecker, who I've known for a few years now. And I thought it was very important because he's obviously looking at the caveats of digitalization. He's an emeritus professor of global health policy at Newcastle University. He's a Canadian political scientist. So we were talking earlier about the importance of political scientists in the debate on the provision of healthcare and the process of digitalisation. He moved to the United Kingdom in 2013 to work at Durham University, then on to Newcastle, and he's recently returned to Canada to retire. And he has a wealth of publications. He's very well known in the area of political science and health. So for more than 20 years, his research looks at issues related to health inequalities within and across nations, particularly focusing on the social determinants of health. He's published many articles, peer-reviewed articles, chapters, probably 4 volumes. And these include, for example, the co-authored books Fatal Indifference, the G8 African and Global Health in 2004, How Politics Makes Us Sick, Neoliberal Epidemics, published in 2015. His work has been published in journals including Social Science and Medicine, Health and Place, Globalization and Health, Health Policy and Planning, and Global Public Health. From 2005 to 2008, he coordinated the Knowledge Network on Globalization, and this supported the World Health Organization's Commission on Social Determinants of Health. And from 2014 to 2019, he served as a co-editor of the Journal of Public Health. So I'm delighted to ask Ted Schrecker to come to the floor, and we'll be very happy to listen to your paper. Thank you.
This would be one of your.
That's fine.
That's fine.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here and very grateful to Louise for the opportunity to address a really remarkable international network that I didn't know anything about. Now, in the first paper that I wrote for trying to address the health equity dimensions of the post-pandemic world, I began with the opening sentences of J.G. Ballard's remarkable dystopian novel High Rise, which is about a murderous conflict that erupts among the residents of a 40-story tower block in London. And the opening of the novel goes like this. And the point here is that for the protagonist, Lang, the new normal is one in which the surviving residents of the tower block, and many didn't survive, are getting by barbecuing and eating the pets of their less fortunate former fellow residents. So this new normal, and he says, now that everything had returned to normal, this new normal is nothing like the old normal, yet it's come to be accepted. My point was and is that the new normal post-pandemic is in many respects likely to be very, very different indeed from the pre-pandemic normal. And I'm more convinced of that now than I was when I wrote the paper that I mentioned, which is in an edited collection, co-edited by Louise. And over the next half hour or so, I'm going to try to convince you, or try to explain to you why that is so. And a couple of consumer product warnings. There is not much directly in this presentation about digitization, although I think there is quite a lot that indirectly bears on its relevance. There is also not much about the what's all that got to do with health question. 15 years after the WHO Commission that Louise mentioned, I hope it's not necessary to go into that question in any detail. Now, since inequality is central to my argument here, I thought it would be useful very briefly to look at some dimensions of inequality as we have moved from the pre-pandemic world through the pandemic to the post-pandemic world. This particular graph is a version of what some people with vivid imaginations call the elephant graph, because they think it looks like an elephant. It was originally developed by an economist named Branko Milanovic. And this version, which comes from the indispensable 2022 World Inequality Report, shows how the world's substantial economic growth was distributed during the pre-pandemic years and right at the start of the pandemic. And this is the period during which the value of the world's economic product roughly tripled. And you can see that this is a graph that treats the entire world's population as one population in terms of income distribution on the best available evidence. And you can see that the bottom half of the income distribution worldwide captured about 9% of the value of growth during that period, which is not inconsequential, and it lifted quite a few people out of extreme poverty. In this graph, you can see the lower and middle classes of the rich countries, notably people who were displaced or dispossessed by deindustrialization, didn't do very well. And in some cases, their real incomes actually declined over the period, which you don't see over the graph. And some of these people are those and Steaton write about in terms of deaths of despair. And on the right-hand side of the graph, you see that the worldwide top 1% of the income distribution captured more than a quarter, or almost a quarter, of all growth during that period. Right? So inequality is growing. Just to put that in perspective, this is a group with average pre-tax income per adult of 321,000 euros if you adjust for purchasing power. So these are not people who are poorly off by any stretch of the imagination. Well, we know that wealth is usually more unequally distributed than income, and that's what we see from this version of the elephant graph, which takes us into the first years of the pandemic, with the top 1% of the worldwide wealth distribution capturing almost 2/5 of all the growth over that period. And the bottom 50%, the bottom half of the wealth distribution, capturing just 2% of the growth over that period. Now, more politically and personally salient for many of us is the distribution of income and wealth within nations. And here I can show only a few examples from a very, very large database. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see the income share of the top 1% increasing systematically in China and India and Russia. It didn't increase very much in Brazil, which was already stratospherically unequal. And you can see trends in income inequality and wealth inequality within a few select countries on the other two graphs. These are much more widespread. Now, here's a much more parochial example. This is from here in Canada. The trend in house prices relative to median household incomes in major Canadian cities. And as you can see, housing affordability was a crisis, especially here in Vancouver, which is sort of ground zero for housing and affordability pre-pandemic, right? With the house prices going up much more rapidly than median household incomes. And then we come to the pandemic, with the pandemic impacts being unequal on a number of dimensions, and this is now very extensively described by, among others, World Health Organization and by former colleague Claire Bambra and others. All multiple dimensions. Here again, just a few striking examples. This is total confirmed infections in Montreal, on the island of Montreal, during the first months of the pandemic, mapped onto median total income of the household. You can see a remarkable correspondence. The wealthier the census tract, the lower the COVID infection rate. Very similar pattern for the people self-identifying as Black, with the highest infection rates mapping rather closely onto those racialized neighborhoods. Again, as I say, this is a parochial example. There are now dozens in the literature. And this is a very interesting graph from the US, showing how much more likely it became during the pandemic that high earners would be able to work from home. The top line is working from home mapped by income percentile during the pandemic. And the bottom line, with a much less steep slope, is pre-pandemic. So the option of working from home was selectively available. And of course, the similar pattern emerged worldwide in terms of not only ability to do things like social distancing, but also access to vaccines. The graph on the left is from an article that came out in 2021 showing the anticipated date of widespread vaccination coverage. You can see particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the world's poorest region, also in North Africa. The date was very far in the future. And as of June of this year, that's what we see in the right-hand graph, with the high income and upper middle income countries having achieved quite widespread vaccination rates. And there's a clear gradient by national income level in terms of vaccine coverage. This is familiar territory, or should be familiar territory by now, compounded by the fact that on one peer-reviewed estimate, it's the poorest 20%, the bottom 20% of earners worldwide who will take the longest to recover COVID-era income losses, partly because their countries simply couldn't afford and can't afford the necessary levels of social support, and the top 20% doing quite a bit better, and the second quintile from the top worldwide already having recovered. So there's again a clear gradient there. Now, on to the key analytical concept I want to bring forward, which is the idea of a tipping point. This has been widely invoked, sometimes imprecisely, sometimes quite rigorously, most recently in the area of global environmental change, specifically climate change, where we see tipping points defined this way, or more colloquially, sometimes little things can make a big difference to the state and or fate of the system. All very abstract. What does it mean in practice? Well, the most familiar illustration is what happens to tropical rainforests as the forest cover is cleared off, for example, to make room for pasture or to be sold as timber. Tropical rainforests make quite a bit of their own rain, right? In other words, much of the water that falls on the forest as rain is the product of evapotranspiration within the forest itself. And on the best available calculations, at some point, when a sufficient area of forest is cleared, evapotranspiration will drop below the level needed to sustain the remainder of the forest as a tropical forest, and it will transition to savanna or steppe, sometimes quite rapidly, which has all kinds of interesting implications, not least that the forest will cease to act as a carbon sink and accelerate the process of global warming. In social science, I would argue that we also have to understand tipping points as occurring when existing trends are drastically changing resource distributions that shape politically possible outcomes, right? Or institutional changes just limit the range of outcomes. Constitutional amendment formulae are the classic case in point. You know, here in Canada, for example, we have a constitution that is essentially unamendable, and scholarship continues about whether that was intentional or not. Tipping points do not have to be negative. The pandemic could have been a positive tipping point in several ways. It could, for example, have led to fundamental changes in how vaccine development and distribution are financed, as India and South Africa proposed at the WTO, and so far that idea hasn't gone very far, with results that you see here. Another example is what could have been learned about social protection programs, which can reduce deprivation quickly and effectively. The US Times headline on the left-hand slide just about says it all. The US social support programs led to quite a dramatic, but also temporary reduction in poverty. That's now quite rapidly going away as the programs are rolled back. So, the reason I reached that pessimistic conclusion about the future is that the pandemic's effects operating by way of inequality are likely to be negative from a health equity perspective on multiple scales. First of all, and apologies for the text-heavy slide, but it is available online, the pandemic disproportionately benefited the wealthiest households by way of increases in the value of their assets. This actually continued and accelerated a pattern that predated the pandemic in many countries because of the so-called quantitative easing undertaken by central banks. And just to drill down a bit into that wealth distribution curve that I showed you earlier, US dollar millionaires worldwide increasing from 46.8 million to 62.5 million in 2021. The wealth at the very, very top of the global distribution, the billionaire class, increasing by more than 50% between 2019 2021. And for the rest of us, or most of the rest of us, a cost of living crisis associated with inflationary stimuli, supply chain disruptions, of course, aggravated by the invasion of Ukraine. So energy, food insecurity, financialized housing, increasingly unaffordable. This is what the Toronto housing market has come to look like. You know, these huge bidding wars becoming routine. But this is a much broader pattern. This is the increase in house prices over Canada's 15 largest census metropolitan areas on average between 2019 and 2021 by distance from the center of the metropolitan area. And the farther you go, the farther right on the graph you go. And you can see that on average, and there were much larger increases in some CMAs, of course, as much as close to a 50% increase in housing prices. Now, this doesn't mean that housing in the city center got more affordable. All it means is that as households, more and more households, especially the relatively more affluent ones, started to work from home, those stratospheric prices spread outward into the suburbs and exurbs. The flip side of this, and this is a much broader trend than just the 1%, is a dramatic increase in housing wealth. So you can see in this graph from the United States, there is more than a $10 trillion US increase in the wealth of the housing wealth of households in the US post-pandemic, post-start of the pandemic. And this is concentrated at the very top of the wealth distribution, like many of the other effects of the pandemic. Okay. So, inequality and tipping points. We have to keep in mind here a basic axiom of political science, that it's the exchange relation between incumbents and supporters, and also between potential incumbents and supporters, that drives the range of possible outcomes. Okay. And the central argument I would make, the take-home message, as the bureaucrats like to say, is that the post-pandemic spike in inequality may mean the tipping point beyond which it can't be reduced effectively by way of social policy has already occurred in many jurisdictions, right? Because the distribution of resources needed to engage in those political exchanges has become too unequal. Again, this is a trend that long predates the pandemic, but it's been accelerated by the pandemic. This is a quotation from a very interesting book by a sociologist who trained as a trust and estates planner, a wealth manager, so she was able to get inside the language and the culture for purposes of doing her interviews. And she says that, provocatively, that many countries are already more receptive and accessible to wealth managers than they are to elected representatives from their own governments. And she goes on to make this provocative analogy between what Amazon has done to high streets. And if you spent any time in the UK over the past several years, you know how that worked. And what the globalization of finance has done to social policy and state capacity. It's not just ultra-wealthy individuals, of course, it's also transnational corporations, which have made very effective use of tax havens to reduce their tax burdens, as this graph from the Financial Times shows. And I always like to use sources like this because This is the Financial Times talking, it's not AOC or anybody like that. And one of the more effective, more prominent tax havens is the Netherlands. And in this rather idyllic photograph from Amsterdam, that building on the far right, that very impressive building, is in fact home to a firm of tax lawyers, as I discovered wandering around Amsterdam. And here again, the politics go deeper than, the economic stratosphere. There's a team of Australian researchers who had concluded, based on evidence from before the pandemic, that sustained inflation of property values has fundamentally shifted the social class structure from a logic that was structured around employment towards one that is organized around participation in asset ownership and depreciation. So a growing gap between the asset rich and the asset poor worldwide. Illustrated case in point here is what happened to the idea of wealth taxation. And again, this is not a new idea. Thomas Piketty, before the pandemic, made the interesting observation in the context of the Eurozone debt crisis, that a one-off wealth tax, could wipe out the accumulated pre-pandemic public debts of the Eurozone countries. Well, of course, that didn't happen. In the early stages of the pandemic, you had actors like the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development talking about the inevitability of a wealth tax. You had the Financial Times editorial board talking about the inevitability of a wealth tax. And by 2023, you have the probable future finance minister of the UK under a future Labour government saying, we're not going to raise top income taxes. We're not going to raise wealth taxes. Very similar thing happened here in Canada a bit earlier with the incumbent finance minister here. Right. Interestingly, and to his considerable credit, President Biden in the US actually did propose a wealth tax on unrealized capital gains, which was probably a pretty safe thing for him to do because he knew it wouldn't go anywhere. It would never get through the Senate. Okay. But the idea lived on. Okay, now, here I go back to what has that got to do with health question, right? Among the probable early casualties of this shift in political influence are beverage-style, tax-funded, universal health coverage systems like the one in the UK and the ones in Canada. The reason was stated very nicely more than a decade ago by the wonderfully blunt Dean of Canadian Health Economists, Bob Evans, here at UBC. A well-functioning modern health system, he said, requires the transfer through taxation of a very significant amount of money from the healthy and wealthy to the care of the unhealthy and unwealthy. By 2017, as you can see from this advertisement, Her Majesty's government, as it then was, had conceded that a National Health Service couldn't be financed at a level that would provide adequate care for the great and the good, which is why this advert for a Deputy Governor of the Bank of England offers private medical insurance. And if we fast forward to 2023, we find people dying in emergency rooms awaiting care in a number of Canadian provinces, and an admittedly small and sort of rough and ready survey suggesting that a quarter of the general practitioners in England had now opted for private health insurance as a supplement to NHS coverage, which is quite legal in the UK. It always has been. Zooming back just a bit, none of this is happening in isolation. It's happening in a context of what the World Economic Forum calls polycrisis, a cluster of related global risks with compounding effects. And one of these, of course, which we have to keep in mind, given where we are, is climate change, right? And associated risks like wildfires. Another is looming debt crises on the horizon, with no fewer than 64 low and middle income country governments spending more on debt servicing than on public health care pre-pandemic. The graph on the left-hand side shows that in sub-Saharan Africa, again, the world's poorest region, external government debt is more than twice as high as it was in 2009, right? The year the financial crisis spread worldwide. You see here one map of the global debt situation in the so-called global south. These are actually conservative assessments of debt distress. The darkest countries are the ones in most extreme distress. You find some other estimates like the International Monetary Funds listing a larger number of countries. And then you have food prices. Here again, even before the pandemic, global food prices as tracked by the Food and Agriculture Organization in real terms, that is inflation adjusted terms, were tracking close to their all-time highs. And after the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine, they reached an all-time high before moderating slightly, but only slightly. And the global food security situation remains precarious. And those of us living in the high-income world, even we observe this on the supermarket shelves. There is also a distressing overlap between the countries vulnerable to debt crisis and the countries vulnerable to food security crises, as you see in this map. The countries in dark with the cross-hatching are the ones most vulnerable to both. And again, there's a concentration of vulnerability in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, all this has to be taken in the context of where you sit, right? All experiences of crisis depend on social situation. Indeed, whether you experience a crisis or a situation as a crisis or an opportunity depends very much on who you are and where you are. The article I've shown you on the right is a very nice ethnographic description of poor and racialized people in 3 US cities who experienced the sharp end of the pandemic. And indeed, especially in the case of Detroit, they had already experienced the sharp end of a decade of austerity in the form of things like water cutoffs as prices rose when services were either repriced under austerity or privatized, right? And worldwide, nationwide in the US, there are more than 1 million people now who don't have access to piped water. So, on the other hand, the housing is a wonderful illustration of this point, right? For every person priced out of the housing market, there is one of my former academic colleagues who's now made $1 million tax-free, courtesy of rising values during the pandemic. So, you know, and of course, if you're a shareholder in a major investor in residential properties like Blackstone, the future looks so bright you've got to wear shades. Okay, winding up with two quotations from quite disparate sources that capture, I think, some crucial elements of the post-pandemic world. The first is from a remarkably prescient book written some 30 years ago by David Reeve about Los Angeles, which he called the capital of the third world. And you can disagree with that description, although today there are parts of Los Angeles that certainly look that way. But the key point here is that tipping points, like the end of the Roman Empire, sometimes become clear only in retrospect. And it will be up to future historians to decide whether the pandemic represented a tipping point, and if so, when the tipping point occurred. Since I first gave this presentation to a live audience, I thought it was useful to end with a quotation from a song by Montreal's poet laureate Leonard Cohen, from the song Everybody Knows, which is the music that I was playing just before the session started. Everybody knows that the boat is leaking. Everybody knows that the captain lied. Well, if enough everybody's come to know these things, and in my view, the knowledge might be quite accurate, what does that suggest about the future of democratic institutions and democratic accountability? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Does anyone want to open up with a question? Peter, I'll bring a microphone to you so that you can, don't be shy.
Thank you. That was very fascinating. So I'm not a political scientist or anything like that. So my question is, the feeling perhaps in some of the general public that some of these things were purposely created. Well, I guess, what is your feeling on that, and what's the general, is there a general thing out there like that? Like all the stuff was created like a conspiracy.
Okay. Well, in terms of some of the distributional impacts that I've been talking about, there's no serious historical question that many of them were created purposefully, right? The UK government, for example, pre-pandemic, since 2010, its tax and benefit changes consistently redistributed income upward in the social structure. The tax cuts in the United States clearly were intended to benefit those at the top of the income and wealth distribution. I am less confident in making a statement like that about the effects of some of the changes during the pandemic, right? I mean, we can observe the impacts and describe them with some degree of precision, as that UN agency report I quoted did. I am skeptical that, you know, in the chaos of pandemic era policymaking, anyone was thinking enough about the longer term consequences, right? I think in many cases, what you've got is the operation of that familiar law of unintended consequences. But you now have very powerful constituencies with a vested economic interest in defending those consequences, right?
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I just wanted to come back to your point about the UK and the increase in the private health sector. And I think that's starting to become very evident. I think there are books that have been published back in the 1980s, 1990s, the NHS PLC, etc. But up until just a few years ago, we didn't really see this privatisation process taking place, or people actually going out of the public sector and choosing to bail out of the public sector to actually get treatment in the private sector. We know that there was a lot of contracting out to the private sector by the NHS, but here there's this process which is very recent, despite the fact that it's been looming over us for many years. Can we pick on a point where, I would say it's the Conservative government not investing enough in healthcare, and now they're trying with the digitalisation process, saying we will save money, we will be able to save the NHS through improvements thanks to digitalisation. So I think this is very relevant to the conference. Can we pick on a point apart from perhaps this underinvestment in healthcare that may have also pushed us over the edge? And now with these waiting lists, people that can afford it, they are having operations in the private sector, and this is something which is fairly new.
Well, I think this is a classic instance of the tipping point where you get a gradual increase in a phenomenon. In this case, people opting out of the NHS and paying privately, and it looks like an incremental change, but at some point, very much like the deforestation, right? It ceases to be an incremental change and changes the equilibrium, if you will, of the system quite substantially. And I think probably the pandemic was the tipping point there. And now you get a situation where, well, if you're already paying privately, how rational is it for you to continue paying taxes to support the public system? If you can find a way of opting out of that as homo economicus, you will. So I think that's it's one respect in which the pandemic was a tipping point. The other aspect, right, and this goes back a much longer distance, is the failure of governments, and this applies equally to Canada and the UK, to put in place and fund a longer-term health workforce plan, right, which the NHS has now belatedly produced in June 2023. The problem is, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies quickly pointed out, the billions and billions of pounds in additional tax revenue that would be required to fund the workforce plan, right? And I think looking at the estimates, it's highly improbable that any government would in fact commit those funds.
So you mentioned several kind of tipping points kind of historically. In your review, did you find any historical interventions that have proven useful in course correcting those tipping points?
Well, there's depends on how far back you want to go. very clearly in the US, the New Deal had that effect. And when people talk about a Green New Deal, that's the analogy they're drawing. But if you go farther back in history, there's an historian named Walter Scheidel who has written a really magisterial book called The Great Leveler. And he argues that, substantial reductions in inequality historically have only occurred after major wars, revolutions, plagues, and state failures, which is not a terribly reassuring picture, right? And, some people argued very early in the pandemic that in fact it was the kind of plague that would lead to major reductions in inequality. And I think what we're seeing is conclusive evidence that that has not been the case, right? So, the most, well, actually there are two. One is the New Deal in the US. The other is the what happened in Eastern Germany after German reunification. And there were major increases in life expectancy and major reductions in the life expectancy gap between East and West over a relatively short period of time. But